Let us begin, ma'am.
Okay. A very good evening and namaskar to all present here. Uh, Dr. Bhavdev Chavra, heartily welcome you on the Professor Avdesh Kumar Singh Memorial Lecture Series organized by Alumni Association, Department of English and CLS Sauras University, Rajkot, especially on the changing climate, ecology and literature. Today we are having fifth lecture in this series. We are having Dr. Rajeshri Trivedi, ma'am. Ma'am, we heartily welcome you to this platform. Ma'am is the principal and head Department of English at Maniben Nanavati Women's College, Mumbai. Her publications include edited, authored, and translated books and research papers in UGC listed journals. She is on the editorial advisory board of 3 international journals. Passionate about Hindustani semi-classical music, she has been trained by her guru Komudi Munshi and loves to capture sound and rhythm in her poetry too. Her project on the collection of some of the rare and archaic bhakti songs in the Garba tradition sung by Nagar women in praise of Adyasakti has been archived by Sparrow in Mumbai. Her short stories, poems, and articles have been published in Indian literature, Muse India, The Speaking Tree, World Weaver India, and others. Ma'am, we heartily welcome you to this platform. Ma'am is going to deliver a talk on Whose Rides Over Forest, rereading Mahasweta Devi's tribal discourses. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you, Bhavdeep, for that lovely introduction. Once again, I want to ensure I am audible and visible both, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, I have been working on Mahasweta Devi's fiction for quite a long time. In fact, I've been working on the metaphors in her fiction. I have done a little bit of work in cognitive linguistics, and in that periphery, within that periphery, I have worked on metaphors. Uh, today's presentation is not going to be a part of my mainstream study, but I'm going to contextualize it with reference to the topic that the Memorial Series lecture has decided under the umbrella term Ecology and Literature. So, more than theories, I'm going to take you to the journey of experiencing what we all, as human beings and as citizens of the world, should experience. I'll begin with borrowing the French philosopher Jacques Derrida's title of his book, Archive Fever. This book has always puzzled me a lot. I will begin with a quote from that book. He says it is to compulsorily have a repetitive and nostalgic desire to return to the origin, a homesickness, a nostalgia for return to the most archaic place of absolute commencement. These two lines have a lot which actually can be related to what Mahasweta Devi does in her works. I find here the urgency and importance of one very important word, and that is repetitive force. The retention of a repetitive force, the retention of a specific origin through repetition. And mark me, two words I really find very important: repetition and origin. So Derrida argues in the ceaseless work to maintain one memory at the expense of another, the archives not only maintains and curates memory, but it buries also quite a few things. So now we come to the third point, which is burying, maintaining, and curating memory. So I was going through his book, and the blurb of the book says that among many other discussion, it says that the role of inscription technology, recording, inscription, when he uses the word, we have to understand it in terms of recording. The role of inscription technology in the psyche and in the archives is very important. Now I'm actually putting a few dots around and then I'm going to connect them. There is unquestionably a great onus on the shoulder of the person who's involved with the archiving work or the record keeping work. He or she faces the challenges of spontaneous memory vis-a-vis psychic archival memory or even printing archival memory. Now, these terms, when you put them together, in 1994, when Jacques Derrida gave this lecture, he had seen the advent of technology, and he was actually visualizing or foreseeing the kind of chaos information technology is going to create vis-a-vis our collective unconscious and collective conscious memories. One thing I want to say here is the one who manages records or inscriptions or digital or non-digital archives, that person has a very important role to play in managing the inscriptions. So I want to quote one of his sentences which says, those in the field of managing inscription artifacts may ruminate on, I repeat, may ruminate on where between the trace and acts preceding it, the truth lies. Where the truth lies. So I was trying to question myself, is Mahashweta Devi archiving something when she pulls out history, mythologies, folk stories, characters in her works? And I found an interesting answer to this question in one article which I read, written by Dominic Oakey, an American scholar. The title of his article is Literary De-Extinction and the Archives of Life in Mahasweta Devi's Works. Over here, Dominic Oakey suggests that the term de-extinction, de-extinction, which is actually a term borrowed from the field of biology for regeneration, I repeat, for regeneration, is what Mahasweta Devi is involved while she is pulling out archives in her works. Mahasweta Devi's works, actually, in Dominic's opinion, are not only archives. I repeat, they are not only archives, but literary regenerations. Literary regenerations of archives, and makes them so interesting and relevant that everyone wants to read them today also. So, what is she doing there and how is she doing it? That is again a very, very important question. Mahasweta Devi's stories and novels or her prosic texts are archives of lives, of collective unconscious, when she's digging history, plunging into mythology, and coming back to the shores of political realities. So 3 things really capture our attention here: history, mythology, and political realities. Keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to that. I must mention here that Mahasweta's readers needs to have a first-hand knowledge of history, mythology, and political realities that she's talking about. Her works may apparently seem to be very easy and simple, but there are references which you need to go back to in order to understand them and contextualize them in the present contemporary times. So again, I come back to the same question: what and how is she doing with her discourses, her tribal discourses? So I came across one very important quote which she has, mentioned in the beginning of the introduction of her short story collection called Bitter Soil. She lays a special emphasis on the concern for the reader's response, and she says, "I believe in documentation." I'm quoting her. "I believe in documentation. After reading my work, the reader should face the truth of facts and feel duly ashamed of the true face of India." I say India. Through the location of these stories, she brings to us the region of Palamau, and she says that Palamau is the mirror of India. She recapitulates here, "I have not written these stories to please my reader." She is very clear. By narrating her or his stories, the stories of the Mundas, Santals, Lodas, Kherias, Mahalis, and the Gonds of the historical and contemporary times, and going back to the mythological times, the Nishats, the Kirats, the Sabars, the Nagavanshis and other dwellers in their mythological narratives. I'm kind of making them responsible for what is happening around in the name of urbanization. She is going to do anything to make her reader realize that he or she or they are going to play a very important role in changing what is happening outside after reading her works. Very clear. One can obviously not ignore Spivak at this time, and I want to quote something from her, a very short sentence. In Spivak's opinion, Devi adopts the stand of being a subalternist historian. All of us know that, and much has been discussed on it. I'm not going to touch upon that part. Mahasweta Devi actually acknowledges and accepts this observation of Spivak, but she goes beyond that and she admits, please pay attention here, she admits, my fiction is also historical and my history is also fictive. I repeat, my history is also fictional and my fiction is also historical. So she plays on these two ideas very, very enthusiastically and with a lot of passion in her works. One more way of looking at Devi's works is that there is an interplay of activism and literary writing, which we all know, and her discourses suggest a model in which activism and writing can reflect upon each other. They provide a necessary vision of internationality, not the international, internationality within national, and the possibility of constructing a new kind of responsibility for the cultural worker or activist. The cultural worker or activist is not just going to keep quiet about what is happening around, only discussing the pop culture or the popular culture, but there's one more onus beyond that. Mahasweta Devi's concerns about forest as an activist brings her closer to the lives of her Birsas and Mundas and Chotis and Doplis and all of the characters that she has described. She was always worried about ecology because as the developments in India show, increasing number of waters, forests which are disappearing, and the kind of anxieties which are happening right now, sitting at home or even going outside, the kind of environment which we, especially in the COVID-19 crisis and even beyond that when the new normal will start, we all are going to be studying the environment from a wide range of viewpoints. You call it eco-criticism, you call it eco-feminism, you call it eco-psychology, you call it eco-humanities. All these areas will have somewhere Mahasweta Devi's concerns coming up very, very, popping up like anything. And that's where the archives and the modernities will come together to understand how to tackle these challenges. Mahasweta Devi depicts how the encroachment of one Adivasis upon the other's territories compels Adivasis to evacuate the land. We all know that. Having their forces ravaged and searching for the new ones characterize tribal life even now. And these concerns, she says, has not only been the dire consequences only of the pre-colonial or post-colonial times, that the tribals have to leave their land, evacuate their land and go to other lands, to the remotest areas, to the interiors. They're pushed back and back and back, not only in India, but in Americas and other countries also. So these issues are not related to only colonial or pre-colonial or post-colonial times. This problem has been since the time of the civilizations that have been born and institutionalized religions in the name of Sanatana Dharma or whatever you call it, any kind of regimes. These problems are timeless and ageless. The problems of Adivasis being pushed from their lands, evacuated from their lands and pushed to the interiors of the forests, if at all forests are existing. Otherwise, they are loosely moving around as bonded laborers or whatever, contract laborers or whatever you can call them. So my presentation is not going to talk today about any literary or critical theory that sometimes becomes more difficult to understand than Mahasweta Devi's works. But I'm going to take you to the journey to ask this question, whose rights are over the forests? And that too, from the point of view of a lay person, a reader, a spectator, a listener, or a person from the audience. I would want to say one thing here before I move further, that Masita Devi is obviously against this whole idea of what is called ecological romanticism, where you have this Bollywood heroes and heroines or an urban man coming to the forest areas and sees a woman with flowers in her hairs and singing songs, dancing around the trees, or the man playing drums and there's a tripod and an animal hanging on the tripod. All this romanticism she's very much against of. And not that she's in favor of the other, she's also against the discourse of an alternative conception of modernity. Mahashweta Devi registers this urgent need to continue a discourse of an alternative conception of modernity and demands the right of the tribals that they should have their due share in the wealth and development of the country. This is her final verdict. No matter what, they should be equal partners in the progress of the nation, which is unfortunately never happened since the times of independence. For my present discussion, as I said, I'm going to ask this question again and again: whose rights over the forest? And she's going to answer these questions through the works that I'm going to discuss. But before that, I want the audience to ponder upon a few questions that after reading Mahasweta Devi's works, do you feel that there is an answer to what question I have asked here, who's right over the forest, or has she left you in a state of puzzle? Shouldn't I, as a reader, change the way I thought so far about the ecological concerns on human rights and the concerns which are related to the people around me? If these questions, my dear audience, if you're not going to ask and if you're not going to ponder over after even today's my session, I think I'll be a failure in delivering what I want to say. For today's session, I have actually categorized Devi's works into three different categories. Give me a second. So the three platforms on which I want to embark my today's discussion is, I've categorized her works into three different types, and they are historical, mythological, and political realities. I repeat, historical, mythological, and political realities. Now, why am I doing this? Because I'm purposely not entering into any kind of critical theorizing or, taking up a subaltern studies stand or feminist theory stand or post-colonial stand, for the simple reason, as I told you, is that I want my audience to journey through the experiences of what I have read in Mahashweta Devi's stories, short stories or novels, or even her prose works. And as I said, I want to sensitize each one here that my role or your role does not stop after reading her works. We have to be involved. We have to be playing an important role in saving forest, in saving and in handing over the lands of the people who were aborigines and indigenous. I want that sensitization at the end of this lecture. I'll begin with the historical fiction, for which I've selected only two texts. The first text, which actually is a part of the title that I have chosen today, Aranya Radhikar, The Rights of the Forests. And another book which I have chosen for this historical category is the Book of the Hunter. So these two books have a very strong historical, background when Mahashweta Devi is asking this question: whose rights over the forests? I'll discuss the Book of the Hunter first, because chronologically that goes earlier. Mahashweta Devi depicts how the encroachment of these Adivasis and Adivasi territories compels this Adivasis to evacuate the land. That is what I will be repeating. But having the forests ravaged and searching for new lands is something which both these novels talk about. This book, the Book of the Hunter, it was first published as Vyadakhanda in 1994. It expresses not only the concerns for the rights of the tribal population and dispossession of their forests, but also it is a critique of the destruction of the environment. The placing of the texts in pre-colonial, this is pre-colonial and colonial, which is Aranya Adhikaris in the colonial period. It underlines the continuity of their struggle, so 500 years or 400 years of struggle against their gradual deracination from forests that lasts even to this day. So the slowly phasing out of forests, which was before 500 years, is also now happening, is what Mahashweta Devi is tackling with this in the novel. This novel is about, the Shabars, the Shabar Adivasis, who were in the British, during the British times, they were labeled as criminals in 1871. And even today, they are living with the stigma of being criminals. And I'm sure many of you from Gujarat and Ahmedabad know about the Chara community. How they have been, criminalized by the laws, and any robbery happens anywhere. There was a time when I was small and I was living in the small lanes of the poles of Ahmedabad. We used to be very scared of charas, and our parents never allowed us to go there near them, because the women would be very attractive. They would come to sell something, and those things would be at a very cheaper rate because they were stolen goods. So I'm sure many of you will find affinities with what I'm saying. So the charas of Ahmedabad is what Mahashweta Devi always was looking around for, that who are these communities who are criminalized, who are stigmatized as criminals, and how can she work to bring or to destigmatize those communities. And I'm sure those who have read about Mahashweta Devi, they know that along with Professor Ganesh Devi, she has worked for these charas of Ahmedabad. They have set up schools for their children, and they also started, I guess, Budhan theater or some of that cultural kind of a place where people can express their talent and unleash their or showcase their talent. This book, the Book of Hunter, is about the tribal resistance that has been documented in fragments, and it represents a particular viewpoint. It's very difficult, of course, to restore the facts from the different sources. This book is based on one of the poems that was written in the 16th century, and it talks of the stereotypes then also and now also. The community who are considered to be, at that time they were considered to be dignified communities, but now they are considered to be stigmatized communities. So the question arises is how to bring them. Mahashweta Devi has a point in what she says. She says how to reinstate their glory, how to bring them back to the mainstream culture is what she wants to project when she is writing this book, and she is leaving this question behind to us, to all the readers. So I would want to quote one critic called Prashad, who says, while making an effort to rehabilitate the histories of the Shabars by rewriting the story of their past glory, Mahashweta's text simultaneously cautions the reader against ecological romanticism and the importance of introducing a sustainable modernity that is outside the capital system, and it helps to revise the local customs which are actually very, very suitable to these stigmatized communities. Mahashweta Devi's text registers this urgent need to discontinue a discourse of an alternative conception of modernity and demands the right of the tribals to have their due share, as I said again and again, I say, the wealth and development of the country. So this book is based on, as I said, on Mukundan Chakrabarti, a 16th century poet, and he actually brings us the story of Kalketu, the legend, the founding father of the origins of Shabar community. And in this book, epic poem called Abhay Mangal, he has given the account of the whole community and how this community, in this book called Vyadakhanda, which is Mahashweta Devi's title, it reveals how the deep knowledge of their ecological mysteries and all this is a part of this book, and how Shabars were truly the caretakers of the forests, and so on and so forth. And the same representation of the Shabars in the 16th century is historically projected by Mahashweta Devi in Vyadakhanda. Uh, so the story somewhere goes around like this, that there is this Tejota and old Danko who have problems, and since this is based in the 16th century, again the king and the palace and the Adivasis living in the outskirts, the same issues which are taken up. I'm sure those who have read Little Ones and all, they will understand what kind of comparison I'm making, that there is still the same the dichotomy of nature and culture, nature versus culture, civilization versus forest living. All these things are very much there in, again, the generation gap of the old traditional old uncle who wants to live with his mysteries and knowledge of the forest, vis-a-vis Tejota, who wants to progress with the community, with even in the 16th century. This is what I wanted to highlight here. So the book of Hunters is something which again you find that there is nothing about age, there is nothing about time, that these clashes have always coexisted as old as the good and the evil has existed. We come now to the Aranya Radhikar, which is in 1900. The setting of the story is in 1900, and the story revolves around Birsa Munda, a young tribal, rebel who fought against the British, and he not only fought against the British but for the land requisitions and rights of the Munda community, the Munda tribes. And in this novel, she talks about land grievances. She magnifies their concerns with the forest, and again she talks of environmental conservation through Birsa's progressive thoughts, and of course about the human rights. So in this narrative, Birsa is too progressive in his way of thinking, as his ideas of social reform, administration, and all they come as easily as she would talk about it now. So that is something which, and again it talks about the moneylenders, the Mahajans, the Dikus, the contractual labor engaging characters, and so on and so forth. So while transferring history into fiction, Mahashweta Devi actually mixes facts with materials from the oral songs in Birsa in this novel, in her text, because she wants to highlight one very important thing here, that they have this orature culture rather than literature culture, the written script. So this is what her major concern is, and of course she weaves the legends into historical facts, and she brings it out with her skills of storytelling and journalism skills. Birsa's vision of the mother forest is one such legend which I want to talk about. Birsa hears the cries of the mother forest as she is being plundered. In his visions, she appears as a young and beautiful Munda woman, appealing to Birsa to rescue her and her sons who are suffering and leaving their land and going away. Birsa promises to protect her and her sons. He's aware about the label recruiting agents, how they entice the Mundas to leave the forest in search of work as coolies. The Mundas are caught in the nets of credit, coal mines, jails, and courts, and so on and so forth. And with the arrival of the Dikus, the Jamindars who occupied the land, the Mundas are evicted from the forest, and the Kuntikati system, I'm not able to pronounce it properly, a system of if collective land ownership disappears, and so on and so forth. So historically, as I said, she's mixing fiction with history and history with fiction. Rather than retelling you the story of both the novels, I want to highlight that she brings this point, that how even in the times of the 15th and 16th century until date, if the regimes, the monarchs or the regimes or the institutionalized people in power have always grabbed the lands of the foresters and showed them away into the interiors of it. Now I come to the second part of my presentation, which is mythological fiction, and I would want to bring in three very appealing short stories here. From her collection, Five Women. Panchakanya, that is one of the stories. Kunti and the Nishadin, and the third is Sawali. Let us take the first fiction here. Is so far so well, Bhakti? Bhakti, am I audible? Is so far,
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
is so
yes.
far so well, or am I going fast, or am I going?
No, no, it's perfect. No problem.
Yeah. So we come to the mythological fiction where again she asks this question: whose rights are there over the forest? And we come to know about many of us know of Mashweta Devi and her breast stories, and we know her as a feminist critic and a writer. And these three stories, of course, they do have this element of feminism, and we talk of women's issues. But I want to use this mythological platform to show that since times immemorial, how this dichotomy between the what she uses two words here, two terms here, the Lokavritta and the Rajavritta. The Rajavritta is the royal, the people in power, and Lokavritta is the common man. How this dichotomy plays a very important role in deciding whose rights over the land or the forest. So we come to the first story, which is Panchakanya. It is all the three stories are based on the epic Mahabharata, and they are. I would say that they are interpolations. These stories are the writer's own versions of what she has read, in the form of alternate history or alternate mythological texts or alternate narrations of mythological stories or legends. So this Panchakanya, Kunti and the Nishadin and Saurali, all the three are based on the on Mahabharata, and I'm going to take them one after the other and show you how women also play an important role in making, you know, making the contemporary citizen or the forest dweller realize that whose rights are over the forests. Let me tell you one thing that over here that the question of who is the owner of the forest, which I said has been from the past times till the present times, is very much there in Vandana Shiva's movement of ecofeminism. And we all know about the stories of Chipko movement and how women came forward to protect the lands and forests. So I would want the audience here to respond to what kind of points I'm raising and questioning here. So Panchakanya is the story of the women who belong to Karu Jungle region. Kurukshetra's war has just ended. The story begins like that, and there are piles and piles of dead bodies of soldiers burning. The whole battlefield of Kurukshetra is reeking with foul smell. Tons and tons of ghees are being used to burn the dead bodies, and the tents which had women as prostitutes, because men would need that kind of a setup at night. The soldiers, they are going away. Chandals were called. Soldiers who are survived are leaving. So there's a big exit and entry going on in the beginning of this story. And these five women who are tribal women, um, there is no mentioning about why they came to the battlefield of Kurukshetra, but they are now leaving. And while they are leaving, on the way they are laughing. They have lost their husbands after they have, been in the war and all. And now they are going back, and they are going back to their forests. And on the way they are washing their hair and near the river, and they are once again making themselves up. The Lokavritta tradition, I'm pointing out at it right now. And their husbands who have been dead, but they, of course, they do cry, and then there is some kind of grief. But now life has to move on, because forest will have trees which are burnt, which are withered, and there is constantly a recreation process going on in the forest. And the women of this Karu jungle region, the tribal region, are following this, that life has to move on. And then they are invited by Kunti and Draupadi. Kunti was a widow. Draupadi has five husbands, but there is this Uttara who doesn't have her husband Abhimanyu, and she is in a state of depression and frustration. And these five women who are giggling and laughing on the shores of the river, on the banks of the rivers, they are called by the old nurse who belongs to the same region, to take care of Uttara, to make her laugh, to make her once again breathe some kind of life into her dying soul, because she is pregnant and she's without any kind of knowledge. She's very young. She doesn't know how to handle this Abhimanyu's death. And these these five women, they ask this old nurse a question that, is this a Dharma Yuddha? What is a Dharma Yuddha? The Dharma Yuddha is the victory of good over evil. People who believe in the philosophy of Rajavritta are the people who are landowners, right? They have fought this big war for land, for which our husbands, who were foot soldiers, who were not given a horse or an elephant to ride upon, they died in great numbers. Will they be getting a heaven, because the heaven was promised to the people who would die in this war, in this crusade? Will our husbands get heaven? Will they be liberalized, and will they be, will they get a salvation? These are basic questions which five women ask. And then, of course, they stay back to help Uttara and bring her. They make small mud toys and soil toys, and they try to, bring in garlands for her. But they are very clear that once again we will go back to our forests. We will grow some food over there. Once again we will marry. We will bear children. And the whole question of land and forests, which you all are talking about, is something which does not really make sense to us, the five Panchkanya women. And that takes me to the other story, which is Kunti and the Nishadin community. They are the woodcutters in the jungles. And Kunti, after the Dharma Yuddha is over, she, Gandhari and Dhritarashtra, remember, the war is about the land. They move to forest in order to retire. They are no more with the royal palace. They want to go and settle down in the forest. And while she is roaming in the forest, Kunti has decided that she will serve Dhritarashtra and Gandhari. While she is into the forest, there is one young woman who comes and cries in front of her. She asks her questions that if at all you had to come to forest, why did you have to fight this big war? And then she says that, did you recognize me? And Kunti shows her. She becomes very, very feeble. She becomes very, very, very hesitant, and she becomes very nervous. Kunti becomes very nervous because this lady asks her a question that, remember that Lakshagrihu? In that Lakshagrihu, the five Adivasi people who were burnt to set an example, or to leave an example, or to leave a testimony that five Pandavas have died there, they were the forest dwellers. They were the people who generally drink and, they are into merrymaking, and they are down with any kind of sobriety. And these people were replaced in place of the five Pandavas, and they were made to die. And Kunti was quietly watching that scene, and they all eloped out of Lakshagrihu. And then, the whole question answer between the Nishadin woman and Kunti is a wonderful piece of reading, I must say. And then I move to the third part of the mythological section, and which is again a short story called Savali. And I don't know how many of us know about this character called Yuyutsu in Mahabharata. Yuyutsu is a Sanskrit name in the Mahabharata, which is written in Sanskrit. And Yuyutsu is the illegitimate son of Dhritarashtra. While Gandhari was in her confinement, Dhritarashtra was attended by a tribal woman called Savali, and through her she begets a child. And after the war is over, Dhritarashtra had lost all his 100 sons. So who was going to give him the tarpan? Who was going to give him the last rites? So Yudhishthira decides that it should be given by Yuyutsu, because when Yuyutsu was 5 years old, he was in the palace, and he was sent to the Guru Gruha. And Guru Gruha again had separate chambers for royal students and the students of the Dasis. Vidur was a Dasi Putra. So at that time, when this boy was sent to, Yuyutsu was sent to the Guru Gruha, his mother Savali, who was being ill-treated by Gandhari and Kunti, she went back to her forest. And when the story begins, she is into that forest waiting for her son to come, because he's going to bring the news of whether he really performed the Tarpana ceremony for Dhritarashtra or not. And a beautiful discussion again between the mother and the son as to how is forest and how is the life of a forest dweller, how is it different from the person who's living in royal amenities. So this is what I wanted to tell. Now I move on to the third part, which is political realities. And I have many stories actually to discuss over here. How much time I have, Bhakti, now?
Hello?
How much time do I have now?
Ma'am, you can take as much as you want. We have taken 40 minutes, but we can have it more. I mean, it can go on.
No, let me be brief and let me have
No,
some more.
it's okay. It's okay. It can go till 1 hour. It's fine.
Yeah. So the collection of stories called Bitter Soil is a wonderful must read for any Mahashweta Devi lover. Again, the same, now we come to the contemporary times of 1970s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 60s, and all the political forms of government in Bengal which have come. Because when soon after independence, it was the Congress government, as we all know. And in 1970s, it was Siddharth Shankar Ray who was the chief minister, and he was from the Congress party. And in 1970s, around 76, 77, I guess, if I'm historically right, comes Jyoti Basu, the Communist, party. So between this, whatever the post-independent reforms were initiated by government in the name of Bhudan movement or Sarvodaya movement, or any kind of relief operations which were carried out by government, is something which Mahashweta Devi, who all of us know had a very strong Marxist ideological base, she questions this. And unfortunately, after she was, she supported Mamata Banerjee for quite a long period of time, but when she saw the failure of the establishment, she withdrew her support, and once again she joined the cause for the people who are helpless and who are marginalized. So we come to this story called SIDS, a beautiful, very interesting story. Other stories are little ones, and the third one, which I love, is Salt. I love Salt, this story the most. And of course, there's one more story called The Witch, which I'm not going to touch upon. The Witch better be studied from the feminist point of view, and other gender studies, or so on and so forth. So SIDS is a beautiful story of Kurad, a tribal village. Again, these all her villages, tribal villages, are in the Pulamau region, and this story has the forest around and one patch of dry, parched land in the middle of the forest, and that is where the Dulan, the character's name is Dulan Ganju. He is the caretaker of this dry, parched land. So around surrounding this land, a big piece of land is the forest and all. But he's taking care of this land, and he has been paid for these ravines. Just barren ravines are there, and barren small hillocks, and patchy lands are there. Parched land is there, and he has been paid by the Mahajan. Lakshman Singh of the village. So there's this parched land, and again, even among the forests, let us understand one thing. Even among the forests, also there is intra-forestism, if I can use that term. So there is the land of the people who are in power. There is the land who is in possession of the foresters, and there is the land which is much inhabited by animals. So in Salt you come across all these three parties, but in SIDS we talk about these two two classes of people. One is Dulna and his tribe, the foresters, and on the other side is Lakshman Singh. So what was this land? Why was he paid for that? He was paid to take care of this land so that Lakshman Singh, the Mahajan, whenever he wanted to kill somebody, if somebody would rebel or if somebody would go against him, if somebody would rebel against him, he would be killed. That person, the victim, would be killed, and the victim would be buried in this parched land. Where there were just ravines, and they would dig. Dulna would dig a grave there and dump the corpse of the dead person over there. And why is this kind of a rebel coming up? Because this movement of Bhudan has all of a sudden started in this Kurad village, and there are young volunteers, like young Marxist people who are coming up into force. They're not on power, but they are gathering and they're making organizations, and they want to help the landless laborers and the land of the tiller. They want to give a voice and a recognition to that. So under the Bhudan movement, this man Dulna is given this parched land, and every year the government would give them seeds to sow over there. But everyone knew that the seeds were being outrightly sold, because it was very difficult to sow seeds in that parched barren land, because nothing was going to grow out of it. But every time Lakshman Singh would arrange for some kind of seeds money to Dulna, and Dulna would do in turn do this favor of burying the dead bodies and so on and so forth. So under the Bhudan movement, he got this piece of land, barren land. And all of us, when we have seen stories and we have seen films where this kind of dichotomous situation was prevailing. So um, there are 7 to 8 people who are buried in Dulna's barren land. But till one day, Dulna realizes that his own son Dhatwa, he has 2 sons, Dhatwa and Latwa. One of them he has become a victim of the rebel, because they were against this bonded labor, Dulna's son and the other, rebels. They were fighting against Lakshman Singh, the Mahajan's tactics. So one day Dulna receives the dead body of his son Dhatua, and he gets the biggest shock of his life when he has to bury that in that forest, the dry forest as he calls it, because that part of the forest does not have any vegetation. So, or still it's a part of that forest. So that's where he gets the first kick and trigger. And after a few years, after 2 or 3 years, his second son is also Latua is also brought there. And then his anger and his agony knows no bound. And one day he kills Lakshman Singh, the Mahajan. He makes things loud, as if Lakshman Singh's cousin had killed him. And then he kills Lakshman Singh and he buries them. He buries him in the same parched land along with other 8 to 10 people. And then he decides that this time when I get the seeds, I'm going to, because now after that part of forest land, after the burial of so many dead bodies, has become very fertile, and it has been dug, so it has become very, very soft now. And he sows the seeds there, and at the end he says that I'm going to make a forest here, and I'm going to keep all these people who are dead alive. And he sees his rice crop growing up in that fertile land. So again, the Mahajan's land and Mahajan's passion for land and his grace in the form of giving Bhudan to this man has a very typical, handling of the theme so far as the story Seeds is concerned. Little Ones is again a very important story. I'm sure many of you must have read it. It's in a surrealistic mode, because one day, Mashweta Devi, how did she write this story? I was reading about that in some article, and she says that I came across some African community, some anthropological story of some African community, where she comes across the news that one pygmy community, one segment of the pygmy community, those are generally short. They actually during famine, suffered from a lot of starvation and malnutrition. And scientific, and medical tests showed that they had shrunk in height. And, because of these two, malnutrition and these two states of food, malnutrition and starvation, they had actually become smaller in size. And in this story, it is shown in a very surrealistic mode, where there is a relief officer who is newly appointed to this forest region. There's a lot of famine around, and he comes with his fresh stock of food, which has to be the ration food, which has to be distributed. And he gets this news that at night, these small children come and they loot this ration groceries, and they go away back to this hill. So then he comes to know that who are these boy children? They are the Agaria community people, and Agaria community people are the people who in olden times used to do iron mining. Iron mining was one of the beginnings of the civilizations which started, setting in. So they were actually the miners, and the hill which they used to worship was to be blasted by the government officials, because they wanted to blast that and bring out iron ore, the raw iron ore from that. And these 185 agarias actually, they rebelled and they killed those officers, and then they ran away to these hillocks because they wanted to protect that hill, which was actually for them their god, the iron god. And this iron god also had another, a sibling called Jwalamukhi, the sun god. So they wanted to actually, retain those, preserve those hills as temples of deities, their own deities. And then there's the story again. A lot of mythological and legendary story comes in about their king called. The name of the king it is 1 minute. Lohigand, and he has 12 brothers and one wife, and all those stories, Ma Sita Devi stories come with a light, anecdote or legendary anecdote, or some kind of sarcasm, or some kind of humor, and some kind of surrealistic images. And then towards the end, the story which she had read somewhere, it takes shape into this short story, and she brings it in a very very romanticized form, that how this man, 180 rebellions who had ran away to the hillocks, and how they were starving, they had no water to live, they had no razors to shave their heads. The men did not have razors to shave their head. The women, their breasts had dried because they could not produce children. Their breasts were sagging. So because of this, and their hair were all gray, and their size had become small, and their hair, like, at night if you see them, you would feel that there are some children who would have silver hair, and the whole idea of a pygmy-sized figure is what Mahashweta Devi projects, and the relief officer is very scared when he sees these people. And then they laugh at him, and then they touch him, and they make a circle around him, and they tell him that we are now only 14 left. And one of the lines which one of the old men says is, our penises and our breasts have dried up because we don't have a proper place to cultivate our food, or we are in the hillocks and we have nothing, we have no lands amidst this foreign land, although we belong to this. So this is where Little Ones is a very interesting story, where Mahashweta Devi asks these questions, that whose rights over forests. And today, when we have the challenging question of deforestation and the government is now trying to build forests on industries and remove industries, or trying to expand forests. So what are we going back to is the question which Mahashweta Devi asks. And we now come to the third story and the last part of my presentation, which is the salt story called Salt. Again, the same, there is the small village again in a tribal area, and the whole story actually is the villages which the story talks about are under the Forest Reserves Act. They are covered under that act. And here we have three parties. As I said, the foresters, the forest dwellers, the government, and the animals who live in the forest, whose lands we encroach. And even the animals are also not going to tolerate, because it is their right over the land. And there is the salt in between. So there's again the zamindar who doesn't want to sell salt to the forest dwellers, because the forest dwellers have gone against him. He wants to punish them, and he stops selling salt. And very very intelligently, Mahashweta Devi brings all the elements, the scientific elements of salt. When you don't consume it, what happens to your bodies? And then there is a rebel again, the forest dweller. He has gone to Kolkata and worked there, but came back again to serve his own people. And then how, because the whole forest was deprived of getting salt, how this group of 2 or 3 people, young men, they actually realized that the government is actually throwing a lot of salt in the forest lands where the elephants live, and because the elephants love to lick the salt, and the the common man is not getting salt, but the elephant is getting salt. And these three people, they go to the elephant's land and steal salt from there and bring it back to their community, till one day one very kind of a mad kind of crazy elephant who's away, who has actually disjointed himself from his community, from his herd. He kills these three people, and the government announces that these three people were killed because they were drunk and they had gone to the forest where the elephants had actually crushed them. So again, the question is, whose rights over the lands? The animals, or the flora and fauna, or the government, or the forest dwellers, is something which is addressed in a very different manner in this short story. There cannot be any conclusions to these kind of questions, or there cannot be permanent answers to this question, whose rights over the forest. I rest my talk here and open for questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rajshri ma'am,
Yeah.
for this really a great breadth in your talk. If nothing else, we all have got an idea, a synoptic idea about this great writer, Mahashweta Devi, through the three aspects that you mentioned. You took us along: history, mythology, and reality. And I see right now, I find in the chat section there is one question already. So in this interaction section now that we have with you, ma'am, I would first request Professor Jhala to again put forward his question. Professor Jhala, I think you are with us. Ma'am, I think we have lost contact with him, but good thing is that he has left his question there in the chat section, where he wants you to elaborate upon the thing that you mentioned in your talk, that Sanatan Dharma pushes Adivasis further and further. Professor Jhala wants to know, can you please elaborate this opinion of yours? Ma'am.
Okay, thank you for the question. I did not say that the Sanatana Dharma pushed the foresters, the forest dwellers ahead and ahead. I was trying to make a point that that Adivasis have been there before the Sanatana Dharma was actually institutionalized in some or the other way. These, like, for example, this story called salt, or if you talk to the people, for little ones, the community, the Agaryas, they call themselves the descendants of a demon, an asura. So these people, I don't know how many of you must have read Dhruva Bhatt in Gujarat, where there are communities, tribal communities, who have existed for centuries and millennium. And this was the point I was trying to make, that they've always been there, and to the level that I think one of the stories of Dhruva Bhatt which I like was Tatvamasi, where there's one point which comes that they had always, the tribals always had a direct connection with the supernatural powers. because they claim that they are the descendants from that supreme deities or so-called supernatural powers, whether good or evil. So I was trying to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Hardeep Singh has a question, I think, as I see it.
Yes.
Hardeep, can you put your question, please?
My question is very simple. That can we call it is our mutual understanding, mutual responsibility to protect, preserve, and persevere for the forest, as the civilization says that they say, for example, as you mentioned that we to whom it belongs. I think it would be right to say that more to the tribals and the animals, fauna, rather than to human civilization that we have developed. But ultimately, it is, I think, that as per the mythologies that has been referred by the Devi Madam, and yourself also emphasize upon that. Can we call it as our mutual responsibility to protect and preserve?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If I'm using at least 10 notebooks in my lifetime, I must plant one tree. That the onus lies on the shoulder of every human being who resides on this planet. Yes, you very rightly pointed out, and this is what I wanted to highlight in today's presentation, rather than just talk of theories, literary or critical theories. That let us understand what Mahasita Devi's works awakens us to. It tells us that you are equally responsible for whatever is happening around, and you can't just keep your eyes closed for that. Yes, very much, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. There is an observation by Bhakti also.
Yeah, please do. I love to hear Bhakti from with her own voice rather than the chat.
Yes, please.
Yes, Bhakti.
Ma'am, I think the reference to Sanatan Dharma would also be when Mahashweta Devi makes Kunti confront the Nishadin, and in some of the stories, and in other stories also, like when this discourse about the people who were, I mean, the subaltern people within Mahabharat. So, like, the Sanatan Dharma is questioned often for, not in this reference, in the sense that Arjun's clearance of Khandavprasth, once they got it, the Nishadins, even the Nagas, all were, they were completely evacuated. Some of them were brutally killed. So the original text refers to the whole thing, and there is, within the text itself, towards the end, there is this reference where these people question, and Arjun is also made to repent for. I mean, he has to do a pashyatap for doing this because he has been questioned also. So I think this is where the question on Sanatan Dharma is often put against Sanatan Dharma, as in Mahabharata, where the discourse, as you said, the forest dwellers come and question, because for them the ownership and the consumerist behavior of the people outside is a bit of novelty, if not something shocking, but at least novelty.
Exactly. This is what actually I wanted to tell you when I'm making this presentation, that Mahashweta Devi is actually stirring the fluid of time, location, space, characters, and she's saying that this problem has been for times immemorial, and how the mainstream texts, or how the so-called canonical texts have dealt with them, and how the subversive literature, or the alternate literature, or alternate communities, or alternate, or even tribal communities, or the marginalized sections, how their voice has now started coming up. But that is what she's doing to her stories also. If you take the Draupadi, that short story, I did not want to bring that here because it will again open up a very big discussion. Draupadi is her story, short story Draupadi, is a palimpsest. It is actually contextualizing Draupadi's character in the times of the contemporary times of 1970s and 60s, where the Naxalite movement was at its peak. And Draupadi this time doesn't need Krishna. She is She is bold enough to come out naked and show that this is what you all have done to me. And actually, Mahashweta Devi is revisiting this character, contextualizing this character into something which is totally unimaginative, which is totally a shock for the reader. Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
Madam, there is a question by Dharmendra Baro. He is asking for your suggestions, and he's asking that since the past, most of the tribal people are dependent on forest. However, in a great extent, ironically, the survival of those people have also led to the destruction of forest. He's asking for your suggestions, ma'am. What do you suggest about this observation?
As an environmentalist, I'm not an environmentalist. As a reader, I would surely say that this kind of literature, which talks of advocating the rights of the forest dwellers, with the help of technology, with the help of social media, shouldn't we all be sensitive to this issue, to this problem? And it's not only the government; it is the joint efforts of the common men that we need to address. Especially most of us here are the students of English literature or any kind of literature for that matter. Should we not raise these questions again and again? Because when we talk of universities and the departments, we have seen in most of the Western universities they have closed departments which don't talk of profits, which don't talk of consumers, consumable items and profits. It is here that we need to pitch in as educators and as activists, as cultural activists, that we open up these questions. We open them for discussions. We open them for responses. And this movement should not stop. It should not stop either with Mahashweta Devi or with Catherine Thankamma or with any other person, any other literary person for that matter. Thank you.
Are there any more observations, questions for Rajshri ma'am? I don't see any in the chat section.
I just want to read one short Aranya Radhikar, one of the small sections translated by Ruma Chakravarti. If you have time, I wanted to read a very short paragraph from Aranya Radhikar.
Please, ma'am, please.
Okay, so it goes like this. The main character, as we know, is Birsa Munda. Birsa fainted after vomiting blood at about 8 in the morning. Birsa Munda, son of Sugana Munda, age 25, under trial prisoner. He was caught on the 3rd of February, but no case was drawn up against him, and the other Mundas until the last week of the May. The Mundas were being defended by Barrister Jacob, and Birsa knew that he would fight for them, but that he would not have to plead for Birsa. Birsa had been charged with a number of offenses under the Criminal Police Code, but he knew that he would not be punished. Birsa could see everything as plainly as moving pictures, although he was unconscious. The novel ends with his death, and he's almost in a state of unconsciousness. Rice. Rice is something the Mundas dream about. This is because ghato is what they usually get to eat. Ghato is that starch. Because ghato is what they actually get to eat. Birsa's life had been guided by rice in some way or another. Most of the time he questioned boldly, why will Mundas only eat ghato? Why won't they ever eat rice and dal like the Dikus? The Dikus are the landowners. Yet on the 3rd of the February, he was caught because they were cooking rice. He was sleeping. The woman was cooking rice. The smoke was rising into the blue sky, and the men who came for him saw that smoke. These people were in jungle, and it is because of the rice only that the policeman is able to capture the smoke of the rice, the smoke of the fire. The tribals generally don't cook food, and that is how the rice became the reason for his death. Thank you. It was nice talking to you all, and I wish I could come back again to talk to you about Mahasweta Devi and the metaphor of breast. Thank you, Bhakti, for inviting me. Thank you, the Memorial Series team. It was indeed a great pleasure for me.
Yeah, ma'am. On behalf of the Alumni Association of the Department of English, Saurashtra University, Rajkot, take this opportunity formally to thank you very much. As I just mentioned, your talk certainly brought about the entire spectrum of Mahasweta Devi's writing. And that, in fact, was something that we will take back from your talk. This entire range that you brought along. And of course, Mahasweta Devi raises very, very fundamental questions, as you yourself mentioned, whether they are questions about political power or the metaphysical questions about how much actually human beings can consume. These are some very vital, or the question about the women, for example. So these things that you have brought about, I was in fact a little surprised when you started your talk with Jacques Derrida, and then obviously you brought it back, and as you mentioned yourself, steering away from theory and into the text that we all enjoyed very much. I will just make an observation here that in the year 1998, when Govind Nihalani had just brought out the film Hajar Chaurasi Ki Maan, as part of that, Mahasweta Devi had come to Baroda. I was there. I had just completed my studies from MS University, and Professor Ganesh Devi was one of my teachers. And there was a small gathering in Professor Devi's house. Professor Devi had just left the university by then, but he was still in Baroda. And there was a small gathering of people and a kind of a informal interaction with Mahasweta Devi in 1998. And out of which would form a few question and answers. And in fact, Professor Avdesh Kumar Singh, whom we are remembering today, who used to edit Critical Practice for a very, very long time, brought this as a form of an interview. He said, when I submitted the interaction I had with Mahasweta Devi, he said, this can very well, these are very well-framed questions that you have, and you have jotted down. It was the old-time way of jotting down the answers, and that came out in Critical Practice as Mahasweta Devi's interview, with the title that what she said then, and what is really what we can ponder upon as one of the fundamental functions of writers or thinkers or critics, to disturb the status quo. What Mahasweta Devi had then said is that I write to make you angry. I write to make you angry, to unsettle yourself, to take note of things that are happening that should not happen actually. And as a result, all of you who are mostly educated, well-educated city dwellers, incidentally, Mahasweta Devi has an MA in English from Calcutta University. And then look at her entire journey of her dedication and work with all the tribals in 4 states, West Bengal, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, and all that. And she was addressing to us young people primarily, but hoping that like we would also fundamentally ask certain things which are assumed as regards power or as regards gender stereotyping and so on and so forth. And this, I was just reminded listening to your talk about this wonderful session I had, and I just wanted to share this with you and you all, dear audience.
Experience of yours in your voice, yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. And it was really wonderful. I, on behalf of not only the department, the Alumni Association, but we have had nearly 46 people attending from across the country, your talk. And out of which senior professors like Professor Prashant Sinha from Pune is still there with us. Principal Ayaz Khan Babi, a very senior teacher, a former principal of Rajkumar College. He attends and he is a senior friend to all of us. Professor Sambhav Burde, former professor and head from Mumbai University, has left an observation and thanking you, ma'am. So I bring all these together as incidentally also the president of the Alumni Association. It really becomes my duty also to formally thank you today for this wonderful session we have all had. So I thank you. I thank all the people across India who have joined. I thank my team, my wonderful team, also including Bhakti, who first established contact with you.
My regards to all the dignitaries and love to all the youngsters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.